Hi everyone, welcome to this week's edition of the podcast, and I'm joined by Anna and Ayenat this week. Hi guys, thanks so much for joining me, and I think we should dive right in because yesterday we had an exclusive story from our colleague Elisa, which dug into the US's priority for the UN General Assembly. So the US has had quite an interesting relationship with the UN, or maybe I should say this administration has had quite an interesting relationship with the UN. So it was very interesting to see them lay out what their priorities are for the UN General Assembly. And it's actually good that they will be showing up. They didn't show up to the World Health Assembly, which was in May. So, Anna, can you take us through what their priorities are and what changes they want from the UN in general?
Sure, yeah. As you said, this particular administration is not that fond of the UN. There have been various frustrations in terms of inefficiencies, sovereignty issues, quote unquote liberal agenda. So the email that we obtained was an email that was sent by the State Department to all of the US embassies across the world. And it basically, articulated point blank a lot of these frustrations ahead of the UN General Assembly in September. I think most notably, it said that the US is not going to shoulder the world's burden when it comes to humanitarian assistance. And I think that's really critical, even if it's just, being reinforced, because, the US has been the UN's largest donor since the founding of the UN in 1945. It's signaled that it's going to continue to make cuts, including in the recent rescissions package. So there's no reason to think that it's not going to continue to pursue these cuts. But anyway, back to the email, it laid out 3 policy priorities, which was peace, sovereignty, and liberty. It did not mention development, which alongside peace and security and human rights are the interconnected pillars of the UN Charter. And rather, the email actually kind of slammed the UN for a human rights agenda that it said, quote unquote, mocked liberty, supposedly kind of forcing a politicized liberal agenda against the sovereign will of other governments. So this no doubt also alludes to kind of the criticisms that the administration has leveled against USAID for, among other things, like promoting LGBTQ plus rights, supposedly in governments that don't want that. And I think, you see state sovereignty as this running theme in President Trump's approach to the UN. We see this time and again. We saw it during the first Trump administration, when he went to UNGA and spoke. He talked about, infringing on national sovereignty. He declared that he will always put America first, and that other leaders likewise should do the same thing and put their own countries first. So this idea of sovereignty and liberty, the email tied it very closely to freedom of expression, which it called the cornerstone of liberty. And I thought that was interesting because, the Trump administration has been accused of stifling freedom of expression here in the US when it comes to like student protesters, law firms that once represented Democratic clients and things like that. So it's an interesting kind of dichotomy there, calling for freedom of expression. But in all, the email did say it was going to work with the UN on areas of mutual concern, but it's pretty clear that the US is going to do it on its own terms.
I found so many things interesting within that email. I think, first of all, the funding aspect of it, that the US is no longer going to shoulder the burden. In 2023, I think it was 13 billion that the US gave to the UN. But I always want to note this big part and scream out this big part, that 75% of it was voluntary contributions coming from the UN. I also found the part about the liberal agenda really quite interesting because I think it mentioned certain countries pushing a liberal agenda. And I think a lot of countries would probably argue that just a while back, we could probably have put the US as one of those countries pushing a liberal agenda. And this may seem like quite a 180 in terms of like how the US is now going to deal with other countries who probably considered it a partner when it came to certain issues like human rights issues, like LGBTQ rights issues. So I find that interesting. And I also wonder how that's going to play out in this particular UN General Assembly. And I think the UN has also tried to maintain this relationship with the country. So I think it's interesting that they say they will continue to engage with the UN, but specifically on their own terms. And then development missing from the agenda. That's quite interesting as well, because I feel like probably a lot of people are saying that it's difficult for you to push the rest without development. And I think the other stories that we jumped into are going to highlight that. What do you think we can expect then from the UN General Assembly, Anna?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think a lot of similar things. It's interesting. The first Trump administration, it wasn't that antagonistic of a relationship. You had the Secretary General Antonio Guterres come visit the White House. I want to say twice. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that. But so it wasn't that bad of a relationship. I think a lot will depend, but again, Trump 2.0 is very different from Trump 1.0. We do not have a confirmed UN ambassador. That would be Mike Waltz, who would that's Trump's nominee, who was ousted from the administration, resigned after Signalgate scandal, if you will. I think once we have an ambassador in place, things will be a bit clearer. But I think, this email, what was really notable about it is it, like you said, it just laid it out. We are not going to be the world's top donor. We've been clear about the cuts. We've been clear about what we see as a liberal agenda. I think you're going to see this in this. I actually don't know if Trump is making a speech, but you're going to see this a lot at the UN. And I'm not sure you're going to see a huge U.S. delegation at the UN either, because again, in terms of priorities, September, we have the budget talks back in Washington. So of course you will see U.S. representation, but it may also just be a little bit more quiet and under the radar than in past years. But again, the email really pretty much says what this administration feels. There's no gray area.
And in terms of sovereignty, I guess we're going to see a lot more of the US pulling out of certain agreements. They've pulled out of the pandemic agreement already. And I think that has been like subject to so much debate on how it infringes on country sovereignty. And I think there'll be a lot more. I think the UN's bid to sort of have a say on what happens with AI might be one area. Do you see other areas that we might see the US pulling out of?
That's a good question. They've already pulled out of so much. So it's sort of like what's left. I think the bigger thing will be the funding cuts, not necessarily completely pulling out. There was peacekeeping is a huge part of the contributions that the U.S. makes. And they've signaled that they'll be cutting support for peacekeeping. But at the same time, they've also signaled some support for certain peacekeeping operations. So I don't think we're going to go down to zero. I mean, the U.S. routinely under a Republican administration tends to withdraw from like the UN Human Rights Council, which it has fundamental problems with. And that's already happened. I believe it's withdrawn from UNESCO. So I think what's left is not so much withdrawing completely from different agencies. It will still continue to be involved in the World Food Program. It will be a question, though, of money and budget and what it's willing to give. And, again, it's specifically mentioned before World Food Program as an entity it will continue to be engaged with, but the cuts are significant there as well.
Exactly. Money is a big part of this because we're already seeing on the ground what a withdrawal of funding cuts, what effects US funding cuts have on the ground on programs that are supported by the WFP or supported by UNHCR. And we had our contributing reporter who's based in Malawi, Madalito, visit Dzaleka refugee camp, which is the only refugee camp in Malawi, which houses around 60,000 refugees from different African countries who are fleeing conflict. And the cuts have had a severe impact on that. Ayenat, can you take us through what Madalito found at the refugee camp? It was actually really quite sad, but it's a must read.
Yeah, it was very heartbreaking. As you mentioned, the refugee camp is home to about 60,000 people, and it was originally intended for 12,000. So I think that gives you a sense of how busy and crowded this place is. And so recent cuts to WFP programming have required a 50% cut to rations that they're able to distribute to refugees. And so people with half the amount of food will find a way to survive if they can, right? So that means that people have really turned to negative coping mechanisms. Our colleague spoke to someone who had been recently pushed into sex work to make ends meet and to provide for her daughter. There's also been community leaders talking about how there's been an increase in early marriages and child labor. And the police are even saying that there's been an increase in crime. And mostly it's petty crime like theft and burglaries and the like. And so it's just really creating this kind of tinderbox there. And this is at the same time that, of course, services are being reduced. You know, if we have an increase in sex work at the same time as we have a reduction in access to healthcare, that creates a really dangerous combination for sexual health. And one thing that really struck me also about his story was the reduction in staff to UNHCR, which is also heavily funded by the United States. That camp used to have 37 UNHCR staff, and now it has 3. And so, like, I don't know how 3 people are supposed to manage a camp of 60,000 people with varying needs, people fleeing emergencies. It seems really daunting. And this was, I think, a really powerful story that showed the impact of the cuts. And it's really not in isolation, right? I mean, this is a really good example of what's happening, but there are refugee camps all around the continent and probably actually just really all around the world that are kind of facing something quite similar. You know, I'm talking to you guys from Kenya, and the refugee camps here have actually been increasing in recent years, in part because of conflicts in nearby places like Sudan. And, you know, just a couple of months ago, WFP said that they had reduced their rations to the lowest ever. They had the lowest ever rations, as they said back in May. In March, there were police clashes between refugees and the police in Kakuma refugee camp. And so this is creating like a lot of instability, a lot of difficult situations for people who are already fleeing war and conflict.
One thing I found really interesting about that, and we actually had to cut this out of the story because of space, is UNHCR has reduced its staff in Dzaleka to 3 people, but one of them is actually a driver. I think the other role is an assistant program officer and probably a program officer as well. But don't quote me on those last 2 titles. But then it really shows you that it's not much. It's basically 2 people who are going to be working to assist and actually do program work, like based in Malawi. And that's not a lot. And the interesting thing about Dzaleka is that it's a camp that's been hit by several food cuts because of a lack of funding. The US cuts have really impacted it this year, but it's been something that's been ongoing for the camp. But in addition to the worries that they have, like the lack of resources, it's also a camp that has had an increased number of people coming to it. A lot of refugees that lived in the camp before had integrated into Malawian society, but they were forced back because of an encampment policy by the Malawian government that forced them back into camp. So a camp that's supposed to hold 12,000 people now holds around 60,000 people, and these people are supposed to be supported with limited resources. I think they say they need 7 million to ensure that the Russians are now back at 100%, and it doesn't really, there's no really sight of where that money is going to come from. And another interesting aspect that I found was the security aspect of it all, because UNHCR was also responsible for training security officers and hiring security officers and training the police. And the police are saying they're seeing an increased rate of crime, but then there's also this reduction of people that can provide security within the camp, which probably creates such a dangerous situation. So I think that's definitely something to watch out for. And like you said, Ayenat, this is probably going to happen in a lot of places. And I found it interesting that one of the US's sort of priorities was peace, but you kind of need everything else to ensure that there's peace. I think a famous quote is like, hungry people are angry people. So you kind of need everything else within the structure to ensure that there is peace. And I'm wondering if there are discussions around that, Anna, because I know so many people are lobbying for more funding for programs like WFP and programs that support refugee rights. But is there more discussion around that and more of an acknowledgement of like the system is needed to make everything work?
Right. I think, it gets to another article that we wrote in terms of the peace deal with DRC that the Trump administration did try and broker. Malawi is kind of its own situation, and I think what the article did really well was kind of encapsulate the universal refugee experience of being stuck. You can't go back to your home country. Laws prevent you from being integrated into society. And I think Malawi is a more straightforward case of it's just going to be extreme aid cuts. And versus the DRC, which we saw recently in recent weeks, the Trump administration broker an agreement between DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, and M23 rebels, which are widely seen as being backed by Rwanda. Peace deal is pretty much unraveling, but it's interesting to see this effort by the Trump administration. And then on the flip side, at the very same time, this is the same administration that is significantly cutting aid to the DRC. And according to reporting from our Alyssa, I think that U.S. humanitarian assistance makes up some 70% of overall humanitarian assistance to the DRC. So obviously that's huge. This happened all at once with the violence on an uptick earlier this year. The cuts came down at the same time earlier this year. So it really compounded the day-to-day misery, especially in the eastern part of the country. And I think the point that you referred to in the article was Abby Maxim from Oxfam said, you cannot have peace when people are scared, sick, and starving. And, I think that really resonates in terms of just being the truth. You have to have a holistic approach to peace. That's why development is usually part of it. It can't just be emergency aid. There has to be, addressing fragility in states. So this is all part of a very larger ecosystem of priorities. And just one more thing. In terms of the differences between DRC and Malawi doesn't necessarily have resources that the U.S. is interested in, whereas the DRC is home to a wealth of critical minerals that China also is seeking to tap into. And so I don't think there's any surprise here. The administration has made it clear that it has this America first kind of transactional foreign policy. The article points out that Senator Ted Cruz, said this peace agreement will bring stability, but also bring us access to strategic resources and prevent China from shutting us out of the continent. So, I think that's the other critical point that this peace deal entails is if the U.S. fails to act, China will step in. And this is very much a harbinger of things to come over the next 3.5 years. It's absolutely no secret that American aid will be tied to what America can get in return under the Trump administration. So, and that's really something, the aid sector has to come to grips with and hope that they get something in return as well.
So I find DRC fascinating for so many reasons. There's been so much conflict in DRC. They've been so dependent on the UN. They've been so dependent on the US. And what I found interesting about that story is they talk about this breakdown in the banking system that you now have to work with the black market. There's no banking system whatsoever. There's no way we can do funds transfers. There's no way we can do all this. And when you're seeking to have a trade deal with a country, you kind of need a country to function in order for you to do business within that country. So I think this will be like a really great example to see how the US then deals with the DRC situation, because you sort of need to build the country up in order for you to actually do business with the country. And Ayenat, you've had discussions around this, like trade, not aid policy. I'm curious to understand what the African perspective would be on that from the people that you've spoken to.
Yeah, I think it's a few different things. I think the new administration is kind of touting it as something new, but I think a lot of people that I speak to on the ground here are a little bit of an eye roll. We've heard this for about 40 years. So it's not exactly a new mantra, but, we're trying a different way of doing it. But people are very open. I think everyone wants to do trade and people are eager to trade with the United States. But the big question is, how do you do that in an era of tariffs? It's harder than ever to trade with the United States, in part because of these tariffs that have been erected. There's the uncertainty with things like AGOA, which was a program that was around 20 years old that was giving the African countries duty-free access to American markets. And so I think, the rhetoric is very much welcomed, but people aren't exactly sure how it will work in practice. And I came across an interesting story from Jeune Afrique a couple of weeks ago that showed that two-way trade between the U.S. and Africa actually fell by $300 million between March and June of this year. And so people are kind of scratching their heads as to, how the trade on aid actually happens.
And I think it also punishes like a lot of countries. Like you wrote in a story, and I think this has now changed. Like the tariffs have now changed about Lesotho and Botswana being really affected by these. And these are small countries that have certain things that they export to the US. For Lesotho, for example, that would be like their manufacturing industry, their garments, etc. Botswana, that would be diamonds, and they don't actually import a lot from the US. But a high tariff rate on something like exports, their critical export or their main export, is going to have such an impact on their economy. Whereas there's not much of an import of US goods, and I don't actually see, and it's a small market. Like Botswana has 2 million people, so it doesn't really matter. Like if we start importing from the US, it doesn't make a huge difference to the US. But I think there's now maybe more of an understanding and a differentiation of rates and sort of understanding where countries are coming from. But I think the confusion to begin with was a huge problem. How do you see this, Anna?
I think, the examples you gave are great. Lesotho and Botswana, the tariffs are coming out of this mentality of other countries taking advantage of the US. And sometimes the reality is simply just economics. Lesotho probably can't afford to buy the types of U.S. imports that America specializes in. So it's not that it's trying to take advantage of the U.S. It simply doesn't have that kind of economy. Whereas its small textile industry, hugely benefits the country and does not infringe really economically on U.S. exports. So countries like that, I think the original rate that was supposed to be hit was 40%. They lowered it to like 10-15%. But still, you got to look at a country where a small country like that's very resource constrained. 10% is such an enormous hit. And you couple that with these types of countries that also tend to get aid. So you have the aid hit, you have the tariff hit. So, it's kind of like Ayenat said, we can talk about, trade, not aid, but the groundwork for that is not present really in a lot of countries in the global south that simply cannot afford the type of trade that this administration envisions. And Lesotho is a very different country than Germany. So for them to get similar tariff rates, that's the critics are like, this doesn't really make sense. They have to be tailored to each country's situation as opposed to this blanket tariff rate. And that's been one of the main criticisms of it.
And I find that very interesting because I think in almost everything that this administration has been doing, it's been like hit first and then think it out a little bit later. And I think the confusion probably causes more damage than anything else. I think like a lot of countries are grateful that like there's been a process to rethink the rates and everything else, but it's also like the confusion to begin with. Could we have done this a different way? I think a lot of people are asking, could we have done this a different way? Do we foresee any changes happening in that area in just how policies are announced and implemented and sort of thought out? Or
no. You can describe President Trump as many things, but unpredictable is something he thrives on. And, when he brought in Elon Musk, the very kind of nature of Silicon Valley thinking is break first, and think about it later. So it's very much part of this ethos of the administration. So, and USAID embodied that. I mean, that was, just completely eliminate the agency overnight and then deal with the repercussions, which is actually, as we've documented, more wasteful because, you know, you have to go back, you have to rehire people to close things down. It actually takes money to close down programs. And you know, the way that it was done, the very haphazard way that it was done actually cost the US government and taxpayers money. So do I foresee kind of a calming of this? I don't think so, because that's really just not, if you look at the first Trump administration, we had no indications that, you know, things would be rolled out in a more methodical way. I don't think that's how this president strategizes.
And it actually takes away a lot from the argument. I always say this, like, just personally, that like when you do something in a certain way, it takes away from your argument, because a lot of people agree that changes were needed. But then, and it's actually like a lot of people actually look at this as an opportunity to do things right, to do things differently, to incorporate things like localization, and to look at the aid structure and look at all the wastage that was there and kind of cancel it out. But just the process of how things are doing, it's really having an impact on lives and how things are done. And it sort of takes away from the argument to begin with. But as usual, we'll be following these stories. But one thing I actually wanted to mention is something that's happening next week. We're going to be having Pro Week at Devex here. I think this is our third year doing Pro Week, and we'll be doing a series of stories on key issues, as well as a series of events on key issues. Anna, can you tell us what we can expect for this year's Pro Week?
Sure. So we have different thematic days. We have, we'll be exploring philanthropy, which obviously is a huge subject area, given the aid cuts and people looking for alternate sources of money. We're going to look at the MDBs, such as, you know, World Bank, for instance, and kind of where their reforms, they had a big reform process, where that reform process stands. We'll be looking at the United Nations ahead of UNGA, but also kind of explaining their reform agenda and kind of, you know, what UN80, which is what it's called, really entails. Let's see, what else do we have? We have a lot. I can't think of off the top of my head. We also have, do we have a health-related story? But we also have INGOs. That's going to be a big one on the future of INGO.
We have a health-related story that focuses on sunsetting, which I think is an interesting part of this whole discussion on the aid structure that we have currently right now, which is forced to change. Unfortunately, it's forced to change. And we're looking at sunset clauses and why health organizations don't have any sunset clauses, and if they should now start considering sunset clauses, which I think is quite interesting in this moment.
And then one more I forgot is the future of official development assistance. So more of a big picture view. So we'll have, again, thematic days with stories each day. We have several reports coming out, including on INGOs, and 3 pro events next week. So it'll be a jam-packed week.
Okay. And Ayenat, I know you'll be traveling to Ethiopia soon, I believe. Is there anything else we should be on the lookout for?
Yes, so that will be for Africa Climate Week in a couple of weeks, and so that will be a time for African countries to really consolidate their position ahead of COP in Brazil. And actually, this is a topic that I'll be exploring a little bit in my Pro Week piece, which is looking at some of the emerging donors. And one of the things that I found in my reporting was this kind of budding relationship between Brazil and Africa when it comes to all things climate. So this will be an interesting case study of seeing how those regions kind of come together on the issue of climate.
Okay. No, thank you guys so much for joining me. Enjoyed this conversation as usual. And for those who are interested in our Pro Week coverage, please sign up for Devex Pro, and you'll be able to get all these articles directly in your inbox. And you'll also be able to access all our Pro content, which is really, really valuable. Thanks, Anna, and thanks, Ayenat.